Megan Davis, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
What are the issues that Indigenous Australians want to be able to talk about with the Australian Parliament through The Voice?
Well, at this point, virtually every issue. I think one of the reasons The Voice became the primary focus of Indigenous constitutional recognition is that we actually don't have much input at all into laws and policies that are made about our lives and our communities. And that really speaks to, I think, the failure of the Australian Parliament to close the gap, and the entire country to close the gap over 12, 13 years. And it's a very simple equation. If we're there and we have input, you'll get better quality laws, policies and outcomes.
So why is it so difficult to be heard at the moment? There are lots of Indigenous bodies, including peak councils, land councils, that seek to advocate for the needs of people in particular areas. Why aren't they sufficient?
Because nobody's mandated to listen. There's a lot of noise, and this happens in a lot of policy areas in Australia. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of advisory committees, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of reports, but there's no coordination, there's no coherency. And I think what people feel is a virtue of The Voice is that we can get that national coherency back again. But the Commonwealth and cascading through the Federation to the states and territories will be compelled to listen. That's the key thing.
There's a lot of talk about the Lisa Dodson model, the Langton-Calma model, the Uluru Dialogues, and there have been a lot of discussions going on. What's all that about for people who are outside the process? What are you trying to work out with those things?
Yeah, so in terms of what The Voice might look like, we've got 3 key pre-referendum reports that I think provide a lot of information for Australians as to what it might look like, The Voice. And what the government is going to do is to put out detail that pulls from each of those 3 key reports the common aspects of what a voice to Parliament might look like. There's some really key similarities, such as First Nations peoples choosing their representatives, not representatives being handpicked by government or bureaucracy. So that's a really key point. The two-way accountability issue is a really important principle too, that you have accountability, yes, from the government of the day, the executive and the Parliament, but also First Nations representatives back to their communities. The principle of The Voice being involved very early in policy making or the genesis of any particular policy or policy change or new law or legal or legislative amendment. And so that principle is really important because I think we know that being there at the beginning will mean that the outcome is much more directed to what we think is needed rather than us just coming to a Senate or parliamentary committee where the government of the day has pretty much worked out the numbers and it's pretty much worked out what they want to do. And so we're just, it's a Sisyphean task really to turn it around at that point.
Why should Australians vote yes?
Well, at a very simple, pragmatic level, because, First Nations peoples should have a say in the laws and policies that are made about their lives. It's not a wishy-washy thing. It's just very pragmatic. Australians can see that the gap's not changing. Australians can see that we're not turning things around very quickly. And that's because we're just not involved. We're just not at the table. So that's one reason why they should vote yes. Another reason is it will enhance and improve our democracy. It's not going to slow it down. It's going to improve our democracy. It's going to improve the decision-making that's made by bureaucrats in Canberra and by politicians in Canberra. And that's a really key thing.
How disheartened were you by the Nationals declaring they would vote no? And how important, given a landscape where the major parties' votes are declining, is bipartisanship?
I think the Nationals' position is a really good example of why The Voice is needed. They made that decision on the basis of no detail. They hadn't read anything. They hadn't responded to any substantive concrete detail. That's actually what happens in Indigenous affairs. In our community, we have a saying called, leaders are readers. You've got to read and you've got to be on top of the detail. Dismissing something so significant as this without having any information in front of you, that's how Aboriginal affairs is run. And we should expect better of our politicians, but also of the bureaucracy and of government. it was disappointing, and I would hope, given the way Liberal democratic governance should function in terms of responding to information, to detail, to fact, that they would revisit that decision once they had information in front of them, rather than just acting on anecdote and a whim.
Do you agree that bipartisanship is crucial, or does the last election campaign show that it's probably different to what it was the last time we actually had a referendum?
Bipartisanship might have worked 40 years ago. Is it going to work now? Well, I think you have to look at the federal election results to see where the primary votes of both parties sit and where the nation is tracking. I don't think bipartisanship is going to be the key thing here. That doesn't mean you don't strive for it. Of course, it would be extremely important to have the LNP on side, or at least the Liberal Party on side, Peter Dutton and his colleagues, and some of his colleagues have been huge supporters, drivers of this. So bipartisanship is important, but I don't think people need to faint. So people will faint in front of me and say, well, if there's no bipartisanship, what are you going to do? Well, we forge on ahead. I mean, we had Turnbull rejected. We've had a lot of rejections on the 5 years to this. But we just, like with the Nationals the other week, I was really proud of my team. We just woke up the next morning and kept going. That's what you've got to do. You've got to turn all the no's into yeses. But if it doesn't come, it doesn't mean it's going to be doomed to failure at all. This is an invitation to the Australian people who recognise, like we do, that there are some limitations when it comes to Australian retail politics. The Uluru Statement's like a pitch to Australians to explain why we're going to the trouble of the Constitution. And we grow up, we live, we're born among Aussies. Aussies grow up on our songlines all over this country. And so this conversation has to be between Australians and First Nations peoples, without politicians trying to drag it into that kind of left-right tribal politics that means no progress in so many areas of law and policy. And our people can't survive no progress. We can't continue down this path with no change.
Megan Davis, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.